Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Et al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, and I am at the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm joined today by Caleb Friedman. Caleb is the David A. Case Chair of Biblical Studies and Associate Research Professor of New Testament at Ohio Christian University. He's the author of numerous works, including The Revelation of the Messiah, and the co-author of The Doctrine of Good Works, and also Holiness, a Biblical, Historical, and Systematic Theology. Caleb, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. We're excited today. We're here to talk about your new book, Gospel Birth Narratives in Historiography, Reopening a Closed Case. And they just arrived today, hot off the press. If you're at ETS and you got a chance to get one, we're so excited for you to enjoy Caleb's work. And it's a masterful work, truly. You've done just such great research. And so we kind of want to go into what you're doing here with the gospel birth narratives and birth narrative kind of as a genre in general. And so in the introduction, you set out to explain the two kinds of skepticism that you're going to address here. The skepticism of intent and the skepticism of truth. So why is it that birth narratives are considered the most historically unreliable material in the Gospels, and how do these two kinds of skepticism frame the gospel birth narratives?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things I've just observed reading scholarly literature on birth narratives is that scholars tend to dismiss the gospel birth narratives from historical work a lot of the time. And one of the things I've tried to do by articulating these two different kinds of skepticism is to really give some clarity about what the real issues are that are at stake and how we go about answering those questions that they bring up. So, skepticism of intent essentially questions whether a source is meant to be historical in the first place. Right. So an example I give in the book is imagine someone is trying to pursue the historical Don Quixote and using the novel Don Quixote as their historical source.
Right.
Well, you might tell that person that's not intended to be a historical source, and so you're just off on the wrong foot to begin with. So with that kind of skepticism, you don't even have to really look at the claims. You just say this isn't a historical source, and you move on. The other thing is skepticism of truth, which is expressing doubt about the actual claims that a source assumed to be historical makes. Right? And what's really interesting is that when you look at the gospel birth narratives, I would say the burden really is borne mainly by skepticism of intent. If you look at sort of the truth-oriented reasons that scholars have given for why to doubt the gospel birth narratives, those reasons really don't justify dismissing the narratives altogether from historical inquiry. So, for example, a classic one might be to say something like, well, these narratives came into being later than other parts of the New Testament. Well, fine, but they actually came into being much earlier, even if you say that, much earlier than many other ancient birth narratives did. Right? Or you might say, well, Luke has made an error regarding the census. That's been a common challenge. Well, fine, but that doesn't mean that you can dismiss everything that Luke said, right? So the skepticism that does more of the work here is skepticism of intent. And what's going on here is that many scholars have looked at these stories and said, I don't think these birth narratives in the Gospels are intended to be historical. And because of that, I can then just move on and not even consider the individual claims that they're making. And often the way the argument has gone is something like this. A scholar will say, well, ancient birth narratives in general, in ancient biographies, were not intended to be historical. They were intended to be legendary, perhaps giving a picture of what the person was going to become, right? And therefore, the gospel birth narratives are ancient birth narratives, ancient biographies, and so they're probably intended to be legendary as well. And I read lots of literature like this, making these kinds of claims, and then I went and looked at the sources myself, and that's just not what I found. The story that I've been told did not square with the literature that I was reading from ancient biographers. And that's really where I spend the first part of this book, is trying to clarify the historiographic intent, not actually of the gospel birth narratives to start, but just looking at ancient biographies in general.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you do so just so wonderfully in the book, going through these different birth narratives and pointing out those characteristics that make it maybe appear like myth, but then stand in stark contrast to the gospel birth narratives, which clearly have historical elements. So in the first part of the book, you dive into the ancient birth narratives outside of the Gospels, as you just alluded to, and their historiography, or lack thereof. So I'd like to zoom in on Philo, and you refer to his work on the life of Moses. So talk to us, how does this use of sources point to the historiographic material in the birth narrative?
So Philo does something really interesting toward the beginning of his biography of Moses. He talks about two different kinds of sources that he's drawn on. And essentially, those two sources are the scriptures.
Yeah.
And he's thinking there, I think, of the Exodus account, and primarily. But also, in addition to the scriptures, the written scriptures, he also talks about what he's heard from the elders of his people. Now, that's very interesting, right? So he's talking about, it seems, Jewish oral tradition. Now, that might not be a source that you or I would choose to draw on if we were writing a biography of someone.
Sure.
Oral tradition that may be much, much later. But we have to recognize that Philo actually regards both of these sources as being reliable, and he has high esteem for both of them. In fact, he says that he thinks he has a better understanding of Moses' life because he's brought these two sorts of sources together. So he has a very high regard for the oral tradition. But that's interesting because that's not something that you would say if you were just going to write a legend, right? Why bother with sources at all? What's also interesting is he makes that remark at the beginning of the biography before he gets into the birth material. Now, if Philo didn't think that the birth material was meant to be historical or needed to be historical, he would just save that notice, we would assume, for later, right? And say, okay, I'm going to give you a legendary birth narrative, and then I'll tell you my sources for the rest of the thing. But that's not what he does. He actually, he puts this notice at the beginning, and it seems to blanket the whole of his biography of Moses. The other thing that does, because he's drawing on both of these sources, it allows us to then compare what he writes to the Exodus story when it comes to Moses' birth and childhood, and to see what kinds of differences we find.
Right.
And basically all the differences, I do a pretty extensive analysis in the book, all the differences that you find, number one, they fall within the normal range of flexibility for ancient biographies. Mike Licona has done great work on this. But also, the other thing is that they don't go beyond the kinds of differences we find elsewhere in the life. When we compare the rest of the biography to Exodus and to other parts of the Pentateuch, they don't go beyond that either. So we don't see anything that is uniquely legendary in terms of the intent of the story. The other fascinating dimension here to bring in is that when you look at Philo, you look at his biography of Moses, you look at the flexibility that he's given. When you find some parts where he is differed from Exodus, because he's drawing on the oral traditions as well, you can't assume that he's just making stuff up, right? So there's an incredible burden of proof on the person who wants to say these are legendary in intent. Because not only do you have to show that he has a difference from Exodus, let's say, you also have to make an argument that that difference from Exodus was not in the oral traditions that he received. So it's quite possible that in Philo's whole account, he's actually sticking very closely to this interweaving of the story of Exodus about Moses, and then also this oral tradition that he's received from the rabbis. Yeah.
And that's so interesting, I think, particularly the part you said about the fact that you were saying that in Philo's use of the oral tradition, even though we might not use oral tradition today as a reliable source, for him it was a reliable source. And so that then addresses the skepticism of intent that you were referring to, because it's not that this was intended to be myth per se, but that Philo thought this was a historically reliable source.
Yeah. One of the real challenges with doing this kind of work and with using ancient sources is we have to learn to think about them in the ways that the ancient authors themselves did. And we have to recognize that whether or not you or I would use Jewish oral tradition as a source for a biography, Philo chose to do that, and he regarded it as a reliable source. And so we have to take him seriously when he's using that source if we're asking about his intent. Now, if we want to ask about the truth of the account, then that's a different question. And that's what I tried to do here, is really distinguish between those two things, which so often have gotten interwoven together in ways that are just unhelpful in the scholarship.
For sure, yeah. So you identify 4 historiographic elements. They're sources, transparency, evaluation, and then distancing. So how do these 4 elements manifest in Suetonius's birth narratives? Maybe you can give us 1 or 2 examples.
Yeah, so let me just quickly define the features.
Yeah, please.
And then we'll get into them a little bit. So sources is very basic. It's when an author mentions, cites sources. Sometimes that can be a specific source, like a named author, for example, or even a named work. Other times it can just be a very general source, right? To say, I found this somewhere. We find sources implied, for example. So we then have transparency. And this is what I use to describe when an author acknowledges differences among their sources. So in a sense, it's transparency in the sense that the author is pulling back the veil behind their narrative and saying, hey, here's what's going on behind the scenes. Right? So we're getting to see a glimpse of maybe conflict between these sources, which, by the way, isn't something that you would be concerned about if it were legendary. We wouldn't need sources, so we would assume it wouldn't matter if there were differences between the sources. Just tell us an interesting story, if this is Goldilocks or something. So we then have evaluation. And this maybe is the strongest indicator of historiographic intent when you find this one, because it's when the author explicitly engages in evaluating claims in the sources. So we really get to see them doing their historiographic work and saying, okay, of the various accounts that I have, this one is the one that I believe is the most reliable, and here's why. And the last one is distancing. And this is basically when an author places distance between a given claim and their reputation. So you might use a phrase like, it is said. Take, for example, the difference between it is said that aliens landed in the parking lot and aliens landed in the parking lot. The second one is putting a lot of burden on me as an author to say, I'm really saying this happened, right? The other one is just saying, I've heard it somewhere. And what's fascinating is, in so many cases, the ancient biographers that I look at are employing that kind of device precisely when they're reaching a point where the story seems a bit unlikely to us, which is indicating a historiographic consciousness. They feel like they need to distance themselves because they don't feel comfortable just asserting this. So
that's so helpful.
So those are the features. Now, as we look at Suetonius, one thing that's really fascinating about Suetonius is that he actually was an imperial official for a good bit of his career. What that means is he also had access to some pretty impressive imperial documents from the Roman Empire. And so we actually see him employing these a lot. So some of the sources that he'll cite are actually official documents, like Senate proceedings and things like that. So let me just give a couple quick examples of how this works out with Suetonius. One is in his biography of Augustus. Now, the part of Augustus that tends to be cited comes from an omen catalog late in the life. So this is in chapter 94 of the biography. And in this omen catalog, he recounts some omens that happened around Augustus's birth. Okay. Now, an omen basically in the ancient world is what we might call a coincidence, but they would often see particular significance in the coincidences. And so by reporting an omen, all Suetonius is doing is just saying something kind of strange happened that people interpreted to be significant. So he does that with a number of omens. But there are a couple things that are really fascinating here. One, this omen catalog that we have is part of a much larger omen catalog that includes omens from his adulthood, from throughout his life.
Yeah.
So that alone really removes the opportunity to say that these birth omens are uniquely legendary. In fact, there's no reason to think that an omen itself, reporting one, is legendary at all, right? Because all you're saying is something strange happened and people assign significance to it. That's just a straight historical claim. There's nothing legendary about that in intent. But then, how can these birth omens be uniquely legendary if they're set right alongside other omens? Suetonius even incorporates some of these historiographic features in narrating some of those omens, for example. So he uses some historiographic features there. But the real kicker is this. That is not the primary birth material in the life. So Augustus 94, where these omens happen, that's actually not the main birth material. The main birth material is, as you might expect, at the beginning of the biography. And if you go look at it, it is heavily historiographic. So you'll find these four features woven in throughout that. And in fact, Suetonius is drawing on some very impressive sources, including official state documents at certain points for his claims about Augustus's birth. So what some scholars have done is to essentially cherry pick a small passage out of Augustus 94, then interpret it out of its larger context, right, which has omens from the rest of his life. And then also, probably more importantly, they've interpreted it apart from the very historiographic material at the beginning of the biography. And so I think when we actually place this material in context and don't cherry pick it, we find that this is actually very historiographic, and we can see Suetonius trying to tell us a historical story about Augustus. Just one other one that I really love.
Yeah.
His biography of Gaius Caligula. This one's really fascinating. He engages in some of his most impressive historiography anywhere in his Lives of the Caesars, precisely in this biography, in birth material.
Wow.
And that's the really incredible thing. So
Yeah.
just let me give you an example here from the book. So in his biography of Gaius Caligula, he actually talks about how he's relying on the Gazette. And this would be a standard publicly available source, the Acta. So these are open records of state that he's relying on.
Right.
And then in that same passage, he notes 4 different accounts of where Gaius was born. 4 different accounts, right? So this would be transparency,
Yes.
right, in our terms. And then he goes on to evaluate them and gives an extensive evaluation of which one he thinks is right. And he basically gives his own judgment there. And you'll find classicists using these kinds of phrases to describe that passage. So one scholar has called this a classic example of ancient source criticism. Another calls it a model of historical discussion, and another calls it clear and vigorous argumentation. When we look at passages like this, and we even look at what classicists are saying about them, it just does not square with the story that some New Testament scholars have told about ancient birth narratives, and then by extension, it doesn't square with how they've applied that to the Gospels. Yeah.
That's so helpful. And I love your 4 frameworks, and particularly the way you were talking about the evaluation piece. We were actually having a discussion about that, my coworkers and I here in the booth, talking about the use of active versus passive voice in whenever authors submit their manuscripts.
Right.
And we were saying how sometimes newer scholars will use passive voice because they don't feel confident enough to state a claim outright.
Right.
And so it is interesting that you're seeing that too as one of the ways that you can kind of identify the historiographic material, because clearly they either feel like this is maybe not the most historically reliable part, or something they're not willing to stake all their claim in. And so I think that is just like a really helpful lens of looking at this and providing definitely, like you said, the transparency to know really where the factual parts are and where the parts that are maybe unclear are. Yeah. So you just alluded to this, the fact that the scholarship today has kind of moved from the fact that it's not historical, ancient birth narratives, and then by extension, the gospel birth narratives. And so let's go to the gospel birth narratives. So how does the work you have done in this book and in the rest of your research regarding other ancient birth narratives in part 1 influence how we read the gospel birth narratives in Matthew and Luke?
So I think the main thing that it does is it really resituates the burden of proof. So often scholars have assumed that the burden of proof rests on someone who wants to say that the gospel birth narratives are intended to be historical, right? So then you sort of have to give some sort of special reasons why we should do that, as opposed to reading them in line with, again, this popular story we've been told about ancient birth narratives. But if the data that I lay out in part 1 of the book is correct, then the burden of proof actually rests on the person who wants to read these stories as legendary. So to do that, we would need to have good reasons to read Matthew 1-2 and Luke 1-2 differently than it seems like we should be reading other ancient birth narratives and ancient biographies, right? We're not talking about an ancient myths. We're talking about ancient biographies, which is what most scholars say the Gospels are, or the Gospels are most like. So I think it really resituates the burden of proof. The other thing that it does, though, is help some things to stand out about the Gospel birth narratives that perhaps we just kind of overlooked before. So, for example, most scholars will grant that Matthew has used sources for his genealogy. He has lots of parallels in the biblical part of his genealogy, the parts that overlaps with the Bible. He has lots of parallels with Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 1-3, and with Ruth 4, right? And perhaps, in that case, he's relying directly on the Old Testament, probably via the Septuagint. Other scholars have said, well, maybe he was relying on on lists, basically, that were similar to what we find in the Old Testament, but already had some of those differences with the Old Testament that Matthew has. Now, regardless of which of those is correct, the point would be there if Matthew is relying on sources, why is he doing that
Yeah.
at all? This is totally legendary.
If it's all myth.
Right?
Yeah.
So if it's just myth, if it's not meant to be historical, why would you use a source at all? Why wouldn't you just make up a fabulous genealogy that incorporated all the most impressive Old Testament figures that you could think of,
Yes.
regardless of whether they were related? And that's not what he does.
Right.
So all the people that he puts in Jesus' lineage are actually people that, based on the Old Testament, are there. Now, we do want to acknowledge that there are some differences between Matthew and his Old Testament sources. So, for example, Rahab appears, right? We have some different generations that have been omitted that we find in the Old Testament. We find some differences in the names that are used. And I work through each of those issues in detail. But at the end of the day, I don't think that any of those differences actually fall outside of the range of flexibility Matthew already had in terms of how you would write a Jewish genealogy. And in the case of Rahab, I don't think that it makes sense to say Matthew has just invented Rahab out of thin air. So I think that we have good reason to say that if we're going to make an assumption, we should make the assumption that Matthew had a source, whether it be a biblical source. Richard Bauckham has actually argued that Matthew may have gotten Rahab out of the Old Testament and Chronicles. But if he didn't get her from there, then he probably had a tradition.
Right.
That was outside the Old Testament, and we should assume that. One more thing in terms of how maybe some things that would stand out that we might not see before. Luke starts off his biography of Jesus, right, that we call the Gospel of Luke. He actually begins it by talking about his purpose for writing, but also he talks about his sources, right? Those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, some scholars have just assumed that claim would not apply to the birth material. But what part 1 has told us is we can't assume that. In fact, if anything, we should assume that does apply. And that when he talks about his sources, those sources are sources for the birth material. This is the same kind of thing that Philo does. And so I suggest in the book that if we're going to assume anything, it should be that actually these sources do apply.
Yeah.
I think if Luke were any other ancient biography, we would assume that. I think there's a skepticism that gets applied to the Gospels. I also make an argument in the book that Luke employs sources very explicitly, not just before the birth material, but actually within the birth material itself. And I argue that he actually designates Mary, Jesus' mother, as the source for the birth narrative material through what I call the preservation saying. So Luke 2:19 and 2:51, where Luke talks about Mary preserving all the word in her heart. And I argue that that actually is indicating that Mary is the source of this story. And he distances himself, or more probably evaluates a claim in the genealogy as well. So when he says that Jesus was the son, as was thought of Joseph, as was thought. Now, that could just be distancing, right? But especially when we read the genealogy with the rest of the birth narrative, where it's very clear that Joseph is not Jesus' biological father, I think this is probably evaluation instead. So what we find then in Luke is that Luke is explicitly integrating historiographic features into his birth material. And we might not have seen that before, especially without doing that work that I try to go through in part 1.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's so cool. And I think, too, the fact that you're pointing to there with Joseph, that, like, if you do take what has been said to be true, then Joseph wouldn't be his father, right? I mean, his birth father in that way. And then similarly, I think you made a good point earlier, too, that if they were going to conceive this myth, why wouldn't they come up with the greatest, most heroic people to go in the genealogy? And then why would they add Rahab? You know, she's not necessarily got the most shining background. And so I think there is it does point to a little bit of what you're saying. These 4 elements are clearly represented in the birth narratives, the gospel birth narratives. Yeah.
One thing really quickly, too, just to note, in saying that these are historical stories, that doesn't mean that we have to deny that the evangelists are also engaging in theology. It's possible to have those two things woven together.
Right.
And I think that is what we have in the birth stories. Jesus, we have history and theology put together, but theology done with respect for history. So Matthew and Luke, I don't think, are just running roughshod over the historical realities to make theological points. But at the same time, they are telling things in ways that draw out the theological significance of this. And I think they're doing an admirable job of balancing those two concerns.
No, I think you're right. And I think that's true, too, even in studies that have been done regarding the genealogies on the number of generations represented, where, like, maybe the numbers are representative, like you pointed to, something theological, but those still might be actual generations within the genealogy.
Right. Yeah, and to get to those numbers, let's say that Matthew has omitted some generations intentionally to get to the numbers that he's reached. Well, it turns out that omitting generations is something that we find in Old Testament genealogies all over the place.
Yeah, precisely.
And so we have plenty of evidence, both within the Old Testament, within other Jewish literature, for having this kind of flexibility. So in a Jewish genealogy, to say so-and-so was the son of, or so-and-so fathered, did not necessarily mean that that person was the biological father. It simply was indicating ancestry, and sometimes that was also being the biological father of. Other times, we have a more, you might say, more flexible sort of claim. So if Jesus, for example, is the son of David, we all recognize that's not saying that David was his biological father. Right? And in a similar way, we have that kind of thing going on in the genealogies, where they're indicating a genuine line of descent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Matthew is claiming that every one of those links is a link of biological fatherhood.
For sure. Yeah, that's great. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but Matthew's use of Mark as one of his sources. And so talk to us a little bit about the implications of that.
Yeah, so a lot of scholars would see Mark as being the first gospel and then Matthew as drawing on Mark. I find that pretty compelling. So if Mark in priority, then Mark is the first gospel and Matthew's use of Mark, if that's an assumption we can have, one of the things that's interesting about that is that Matthew does not cite sources in his birth material in the way that Luke does. You might then say, well, Matthew doesn't have sources. However, I don't think that's a great move to make, because number one, we can tell in the genealogy that he has sources. I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that he also has sources in the birth narrative, because you cannot see the birth narrative as being spun out of the Old Testament fulfillment quotations that are there. You only gather those particular passages together if you already had a story in which these events had happened and you wanted to relate Jesus to Old Testament prophecies or Old Testament passages that actually related to those events. So we clearly have some sources going on there. But the other thing that's interesting is, while Matthew seems to have used Mark a lot, he never actually cites Mark as a source. What that means is we can't assume that a lack of source citation is a lack of sources or indicates a lack of sources.
Yes.
Right? So we need to actually look at what he's written and say, does it seem like he has used sources? And if it does, then we need to be willing to recognize that. Also, another thing you can see in ancient biographies that would support this is that while ancient biographers do cite their sources much of the time, there are plenty of times where they're clearly relying on sources where they don't say that they are. So Matthew then would be doing something that's pretty normal.
For sure, yeah. And I think that's an important part, right, is that this isn't something abnormal. He's sticking to the genre of birth narrative in ancient times. And so he's very, following kind of the protocol when addressing or not addressing sources. Well, one final question. So we talked a lot about the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And so how do they function in this study? And I wonder if you would take us back to those two forms of skepticism that you outlined at the front. And so how do these two genealogies in Matthew and in Luke influence the way that we read the gospel birth narratives in light of those two forms of skepticism?
Well, I think what we have to first say is that when we read the genealogies, we're reading what Matthew and Luke intended to be a genuine line of Jesus' descent. Now, we can choose to disagree with one or both of them. So a given scholar might say, I don't think that one of them has gotten it right. But it seems to me that if they're both intending to tell a historical account of Jesus' genealogy, then what's especially illegitimate is to dismiss both of them out of hand. So if you want to say that one of them is more reliable than the other, that's a conversation that we can have. But if they're both intended to be historical, then we need to take that claim seriously. And so they're both trying to link Jesus back in various ways. And many scholars have done great work to show these theological significance, right? Of course, Matthew is starting with Abraham and coming down. Luke is tracing backward to Adam. And we can talk about the structure of those and how they fit into the narrative. And there are scholars that have done that much more than I do. I don't really try to get into the theology of the genealogies in this book. But I think that what we have to do is take these seriously and recognize that actually these biographers are writing very close to the events that they're reporting. So one of the things that I do in the book is for each of the ancient biographers that I deal with outside the Gospels, so Cornelius Nepos, Philo, Plutarch, and Suetonius, I give charts in the back of the book for all of their biographies. So it's a sample size of about 95 different biographies because I can't discuss all of them in the book. So for all of them, I actually go through and indicate historiographic features. I look at their use of omens, their use of miracles. So I have an analysis in the appendixes of this book that goes through that. The last thing, though, that I look at for each life is what I call the time elapsed. So what was the time between the birth of the person and when their biography was written, roughly? And we have to work with rough figures here. We don't have precise publication dates for these things. But what's fascinating is if you run that average across all 95 of those lives from those 4 biographers, on average, they're writing 360 years plus, more than 360 years after the births of their subjects. And in many cases, obviously, it's much more than that, 900 or 800 years after. And when you look at that and you say, okay, well, what's the time elapsed for Matthew and Luke? And of course, there are debates about when the Gospels were written and all that. But let's say if you take sort of a midline date for Matthew and put him somewhere, let's say around 70, well, that would put him in an elite category of ancient biography in terms of how close he is to the events that he's talking about. And also when you consider his access to sources, like having relatives of Jesus in the early church. I think what all that indicates is we have to take these genealogies and the whole account, the whole birth narrative, in each case very seriously and recognize that these are intended to be historical. And not only are Matthew and Luke intending to write historical stories about Jesus's birth and early life, they're actually in a very good place to do so because of their access to sources.
And I think you pointed to that too when you mentioned Mary, right? And how the Luke story is like drawing on her own experience and the words that she might have told Luke. And so there is just such proximity there that gives them this elite status in the world of biographers.
Right. Yeah, and maybe Luke had an opportunity to talk to Mary directly. Maybe he got access to her testimony in written form or through a relative of Jesus. But whatever that is, it's an incredibly good source that he's dealing with. And, when you compare, let's say, to Plutarch often is writing hundreds of years after the births of his subjects. Right. We just have to recognize that the gospel writers are breathing rarefied air.
They are
when it comes to their access to sources and the time that's passed between when Jesus has been born and when they're writing his biography.
For sure. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for your book, for spending time to chat about it with us today. We're so thankful for you and your scholarship.
Absolutely. It's been a privilege to work with Baylor University Press on this, and excited about everything you guys are doing.
Yes, thanks so much. And to our listeners, please feel free to purchase Caleb's book at BaylorPress.com. It is available now. We hope you will get your copy today, and please like, comment, subscribe for more content from Baylor University Press. Thanks so much, Caleb.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.